Tonight, I invite you to listen not just with your ears, but with your spirit wide awake. This is not just a tale of conflict, it is a story of courage, sacrifice, and a nation's unbreakable resolve when pushed to its edge. As you watch till the very end, feel the heartbeat of a billion souls who stand for peace, yet carry the fire to defend it when tested. May this journey remind you that true strength lies not in loud threats, but in silent, fearless action. Stay with me and witness a night the world dared not speak of. Background of the conflict: rising tensions before May 10, 2025. In the months leading up to May 10, 2025, tensions between India and Pakistan reached a boiling point that had been simmering for years. Small border skirmishes, infiltration attempts, and cross-border firing had become disturbingly frequent, testing the patience of a nation that had long chosen dialogue over aggression. Incidents in disputed regions flared tempers on both sides, while political statements and media narratives fanned the flames of nationalism and suspicion. Intelligence reports hinted at increasing movements across the line of control, with militant groups finding safe havens and supply lines that posed a direct threat to Indian territory and civilian lives. Villages near the border lived under a shadow of fear, often hearing the distant echoes of gunfire or shelling that disrupted fragile lives overnight. Inside India, public sentiment was shifting. Many felt that repeated gestures for peace were being taken for granted. Diplomacy and back-channel talks yielded promises but little action on the ground. For India, known for its restraint and commitment to peaceful coexistence, each violation felt like an insult not just to its borders, but to its spirit of patience and fairness. Military analysts spoke openly about the thin line between skirmish and escalation, warning that the next misstep could ignite something far larger. Political leaders sent clear but calm warnings that while India's heart beats for peace, its backbone is forged in iron. This climate of constant provocation, unanswered promises, and growing public frustration formed the backdrop for what would unfold on May 10. It was not a sudden explosion of violence, but the result of a line crossed one too many times. When the final spark came, it did not catch a sleeping giant, it woke a nation ready to defend what is sacred: its people, its pride, and its peace. In the tense days before May 10, 2025, the world witnessed once again that India's greatest strength lies not in loud threats, but in its quiet, unshakable resolve. For decades, India has carried the burden of being a responsible power in a turbulent neighborhood. Time and again, it chose dialogue over retaliation, reason over rage, and diplomacy over destruction. It has opened its doors to talks, confidence, building measures, and peace accords, hoping to build bridges instead of walls. But this patience is often misunderstood as weakness by those who test its borders and spirit. Provocations came and went: infiltrations, terror attacks, and broken promises. Each time, India showed restraint, calling for calm when many demanded revenge. Its leaders reminded the world that true power lies in knowing when to hold the sword and when to sheath it. Yet behind this calm exterior beats a heart that does not tolerate repeated betrayal. India's military, known for its professionalism and readiness, stood watch through cold nights and tense borders. Its people, though patient, carried a quiet anger that grew every time an innocent life was lost or a border was violated. Leading up to the conflict, India made it clear through back-channel warnings and public statements that its patience was not endless. Every violation was documented, every hostile movement tracked, and every provocation met with a calm but firm reminder. India does not seek conflict, but neither will it back down when its sovereignty is challenged. This resolve is what shaped the decisive response that came on May 10. It wasn't a reckless outburst, but the final roar of a lion that had shown mercy too many times. It proved that true strength is calm, calculated, and waits for the right moment to remind the world who it really is. In the days leading up to May 10, 2025, tension along the border had reached an unbearable point, but it was one deliberate act that finally crossed the last line India could tolerate. Reports from the front lines spoke of a calculated and aggressive incursion, an armed group, heavily backed by tactical support, attempted to infiltrate deep into Indian territory under the cover of darkness. It wasn't the first infiltration, but its scale and intent made it impossible to ignore. Villages near the border were suddenly jolted awake by gunfire and explosions. Civilians scrambled for safety as the armed intruders clashed with Indian security forces who were ready but outnumbered in that moment. Casualties were reported, and tragically, innocent lives were caught in the crossfire. Images and stories of families forced to flee their homes in the dead of night spread like wildfire across the nation, igniting a deep sense of anger and grief. For India's leaders and military strategists, this was not just another border skirmish, it was a blatant attempt to test how far India's patience could stretch. Intelligence agencies confirmed that this was no rogue band of militants. The planning, supply routes, and coordination pointed clearly to organized support across the border. Public outrage poured into the streets and flooded social media. Demands for accountability and decisive action grew louder with every passing hour. Diplomats made urgent calls behind closed doors, but it was clear that words alone would not undo what had been done. The nation reached a point where the cost of restraint outweighed the risk of action. The final violation, reckless and brutal, left no room for ambiguity. In the early hours of May 10, India made its choice to respond, not with empty warnings, but with a force that would remind the world that its sovereignty was not up for negotiation. When the final provocation shattered the uneasy calm on May 10, 2025, India did not respond with long speeches or diplomatic noise alone. It answered with precise, decisive action that spoke louder than any condemnation ever could. For too long, India's calls for restraint and repeated invitations for dialogue had been treated as predictable, a country too patient to retaliate strongly. That night, that illusion was buried for good. The moment the infiltration and attack were confirmed, India's armed forces launched a well-coordinated counter-offensive that had been prepared for months, but kept under wraps. The response was not reckless aggression, but a carefully calculated operation aimed at neutralizing the immediate threat, while sending an unmistakable message to those who believed India would forever stay silent. Strategic targets were identified with pinpoint intelligence gathered over time: militant camps, launch pads, supply routes, and command centers that had fed violence across the border for years. Elite units moved swiftly under cover of darkness, supported by drones, air power, and ground forces that struck with surgical precision. In a matter of hours, the network's fueling cross-border mischief lay in ruins. This was not an act of blind revenge. It was a demonstration of India's unmatched capability to plan, wait, and strike when pushed to the edge. It reminded everyone that peace cannot exist without the power to defend it. Soldiers executed their mission with discipline and clarity, ensuring minimal civilian harm while dismantling threats that had operated with impunity for too long. In boardrooms and newsrooms around the world, analysts whispered what they would not say aloud: India had just shown that its silence was never weakness, but the quiet confidence of a nation ready to defend its people, its pride, and its promise of peace through unshakable strength. When India unleashed its response on May 10, 2025, it did not seek a prolonged conflict or needless destruction. It struck with such surgical precision that it shattered the illusion of invincibility that emboldened Pakistan's provocations for years. This was not just a tactical operation. It was a clear demonstration that the days of ignoring repeated violations were over. Critical militant strongholds that had operated under layers of protection were dismantled in hours. Command posts that once directed infiltration across the line of control turned into smoking ruins before dawn. Well-guarded supply chains feeding weapons and resources to militants were cut off like veins cauterized by a surgeon's knife. The targets were chosen not for dramatic headlines, but for their strategic value: assets that had long been shielded by ambiguity and silence. The pride that some in Pakistan's military establishment had built on the belief that India would never risk an open, decisive counterstrike crumbled that night. The operation was swift, deliberate, and broadcast not through bombastic claims, but through undeniable facts on the ground. Satellite images, intelligence leaks, and eyewitness accounts told the story. India had acted with control, not chaos, and in doing so, flipped the narrative overnight. For India's armed forces, this was not an act of conquest. It was a statement that the country's territorial integrity and the lives of its citizens were not bargaining chips. For the people of India, it restored faith that their patience had limits, and when pushed beyond those limits, their nation would rise not with blind fury, but with disciplined might. In the region's tense power game, the events of that night carved a line in stone, a reminder that no provocation, no covert support, and no false bravado would go unchallenged again. As India's decisive response unfolded on May 10, 2025, the world watched but did not speak. Nations that usually rush to hold emergency meetings, issue urgent condemnations, or offer moral lectures stayed unusually quiet. The same international voices that never hesitate to question India's security moves or urge restraint suddenly had nothing to say when the conflict crossed a line that any sovereign nation would be forced to address. World powers that had built careers on mediating South Asian tensions remained in their capitals, releasing carefully worded statements that said little and promised less. There were no calls for ceasefires from powerful allies who often weigh in on conflicts thousands of miles away. Newsrooms that dissect every border, skirmish, and parade panelists to debate India's every action found themselves staring at facts they could neither spin nor ignore. India had not started this, but it had ended it swiftly on its own terms. This silence was not accidental. It was the awkward hush of a world that had underestimated India's threshold for patience and the scale of its preparedness. For decades, global players treated the region like a chessboard, issuing advice, balancing interests, and urging India to show more restraint every time its people bled. But when India finally acted with clarity and force, the same world realized that any condemnation would only reveal their double standards. So the world stayed silent. Behind closed doors, they acknowledged that India had done what any strong nation must do when tested too far to protect its borders, its people, and its pride without waiting for permission. In that silence, India's message rang louder than any statement. Peace is noble, but only power commands respect, especially when the world prefers to watch rather than act. When India acted decisively on May 10, 2025, its response was not driven by a hunger for conflict, but by a clear message the world could not misinterpret. True peace demands respect, and respect demands clear boundaries. For years, India's posture had been one of remarkable restraint. Diplomats flew back and forth, back-channel talks promised solutions, and patient calls for dialogue echoed after every provocation. But with every infiltration attempt and every lost life, that patience was tested, and its value misunderstood by those who mistook it for endless tolerance. The strike that night was not just about destroying militant camps or supply lines, it was about restoring the balance between India's willingness to talk and its readiness to act. It showed that the hand India extends in friendship can turn into a shield of steel when pushed too far. No longer could provocation be hidden behind plausible deniability or half-hearted condemnations. The cost of testing India's limits was now too high to ignore. Through its action, India reminded its neighbors and the world that sovereignty is not just a word in a treaty. It is a promise to every citizen that their safety is non-negotiable, and that promise is guarded not by wishful thinking, but by strength and sacrifice. India's message was never about domination or expansion, it was about setting the record straight. Peaceful coexistence cannot survive without mutual respect for borders and lives. India does not seek to conquer land or silence voices. It seeks to ensure that no one mistakes its calls for peace as weakness ever again. The night India acted, it redrew the lines of engagement, proving that real peace is not just spoken into existence, but protected by the quiet, disciplined force of a nation that knows when enough is enough. Behind the headlines of May 10, 2025, stood the true heroes of that night, the men and women of India's armed forces whose unwavering courage turned strategy into reality. For weeks, months, and even years before that fateful night, These soldiers stood vigilant on some of the world's most dangerous borders, where every shadow could hide a threat and every moment demanded discipline beyond imagination. When the final provocation came, they did not react in haste or anger. They moved with a quiet resolve, guided by training, intelligence, and a commitment to protect millions sleeping safely far from the front lines. Elite units carried out precision strikes in hostile terrain under the cover of darkness, navigating harsh weather, rugged mountains, and fortified enemy hideouts with remarkable coordination. The courage of these forces was not just in pulling the trigger or breaching bunkers, it was in their unwavering belief that they were fighting not for glory, but for a promise. The promise that every village, every family, and every child would wake up in a safer tomorrow because they stood guard through the darkest hours. Many of these soldiers returned to base with quiet pride. Some came back with scars that will never fully heal. And a few did not come back at all, their names now etched in the memory of a grateful nation that understands freedom is never free. The world may remember the strategy, the airstrikes, and the silence that followed, but India remembers the human spirit that made it possible. It is their discipline, sacrifice, and calm under fire that reminded everyone that a nation's strength does not lie only in its weapons or words, but in the brave hearts willing to stand in the shadows and do what must be done when the moment calls. When dawn broke on May 11, 2025, India woke up changed. News of the precise, powerful response spread like wildfire not just through headlines, but through the hearts of a billion people who felt a surge of pride that went far beyond politics or borders. For years, they had watched provocations test their country's patience. They had seen innocent lives lost in border villages, soldiers martyred while defending harsh, frozen lines no map can soften, and leaders offering dialogue while the other side plotted infiltration. But that night's response shifted something deep within the public consciousness. For the first time in years, people saw that the promise of peace was not empty, it was guarded fiercely by those ready to do whatever was necessary. Streets that had once held candlelight vigils in mourning now carried flags in gratitude. Social media overflowed with messages for the armed forces, calling them not just protectors but guardians of the nation's honor. In cities, towns, and remote border hamlets, there was no celebration of war, only a solemn pride that the country had drawn a line that no enemy could mistake again. Families who had once feared the echoes of gunfire near the border now spoke of the hope that this show of resolve would buy them real peace, not fragile ceasefires broken in the night. More than anything, this moment reminded India's people of something timeless. When pushed too far, their unity is their greatest strength. They stood behind their soldiers, their leaders, and the idea that restraint is noble, but only when backed by strength. In that unity, India found not just victory on a battlefield, but a deeper confidence that its patience, when tested, will always find its backbone and speak in actions that no enemy can ignore. The night of May 10, 2025, left behind more than headlines and broken bunkers. It carved a lesson deep into the region's memory and the world's conscience. For decades, India's approach had been defined by the belief that dialogue, diplomacy, and restraint would eventually dissolve hostility. But that night proved an old truth. Respect is never simply requested. It is earned and protected by the will to stand firm when every other option has been exhausted. The lesson was not for Pakistan alone, but for every neighbor, every observer, and every global power that weighed in from afar but rarely understood the cost India paid in patience. The operation demonstrated that India's door for peace is always open, but it swings on hinges of strength. Crossing those lines without consequence was an illusion the events of that night shattered forever. For India, this moment reinforced that vigilance must never sleep. Borders are more than lines on a map. They are promises to millions who trust that their homes and families are safe because someone stands watch in the harshest conditions, ready to act. It also reminded future generations that real peace is not passive. It is not fragile words written in dusty agreements or staged handshakes for cameras. Real peace lives only where strength guards it, with soldiers who wait in silence, with citizens who stand united, and with leaders who know when to speak softly and when to strike hard. The world's silence spoke, too, reminding India that when push comes to shove, it must rely on its own resolve, its own unity, and its own courage. In that silence, India found its voice again, the voice that says, "Respect us, for we have earned it, and remember us, for we will always defend it." As we close this story of a night that changed everything, remember this. India's silence is never weakness, it is patience forged in courage, guarded by those who stand watch, so we may sleep in peace. May 10, 2025 proved that true peace demands respect, and respect demands strength. Let this night remind us that unity, sacrifice, and resolve are what keep our borders and our pride unshaken. Thank you for standing with this truth, for remembering the guardians in the shadows, and for believing in a nation that knows when enough is enough. Stay strong, stay proud, good luck, and thank you.